Before we take a detailed look at the variations arising in the main line after d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, knight takes e4, let's first of all take a closer look at the pawn structure. One of black's early achievements is the elimination of white's central e-pawn. He now intends to play something like e6 and eventually go c5, eliminating white's other centre pawn. At the same time, black has got this beautiful row of kingside pawns on h7, g7, f7 and e6, all of which helps lend his king greater protection. Let's now see how this works out in practice. After bishop f5, knight g3 is almost a reflex action, but later on we'll take a brief look at Bronstein's move, which is knight c5. The main line occurs after knight back to g3, bishop g6, h4, h6, knight f3. And now the new star move is to ignore knight e5 by playing this knight out to f6 immediately. As we've already seen, black's idea is to now counterattack this d4 pawn by going e6 followed by c5. But now this c5 plan is reinforced by the idea that the knight can actually come out to the c6 square instead of being stuck on this passive d7 square. This in fact is the point behind playing knight out to f6 immediately. Knight into e5 used to be thought to be a quite scary line, because after bishop h7, bishop out to c4, threatening the f7 pawn, e6, queen e2, white actually threatens to murder black in cold blood with the horrific knight takes f7, king takes f7, queen takes e6 check, and after king up to g6, queen f5 is unfortunately mate. That does look pretty worrying, doesn't it? And it in fact explains why this move knight f6 lay dormant for such a long time. But they've now discovered that black can nonchalantly brush aside this crude threat by playing knight out to d5. On his next move, black's going to challenge this knight on e5 by playing knight d7. And none of white's attacking ideas get anywhere. If, for example, he plays his queen out to h5, attacking f7 once again, black can calmly play queen c7, defending the pawn. In a game between Kovalev and Peter Heine Nielsen from Gistrup 1996, white now played c3, and there followed bishop out to d6, castles, and now black also castled. Although white's pieces seem well placed optically, in reality they'll shortly have to beat a retreat. The game went bishop d2, knight d7, attacking this knight on e5, rook fe1, and now rook a d8, which actually contained a threat that Kovalev overlooked. White retreated his bishop to b3, but then there came knight on 5 to f6, attacking white's queen on h5, and after queen e2, Heine Nielsen played knight takes e5, and after d takes e5, captured this pawn on e5 with his bishop. The point is that if white now plays queen takes e5, the queens come off, and then black takes back his piece with rook takes d2. After bishop takes e5, white really felt that he couldn't exchange queens and go into an endgame a pawn down, but black was a pawn up anyway and went on to win. Instead of playing queen out to h5, white has usually chosen just to drop this bishop back to b3, but then black can choose between a5 and bishop out to b4 check. The point of this move, bishop b4 check, is that c3 can be met by knight takes c3, detonating white's position at a stroke. After b takes c3, bishop takes c3 check, king f1, black should be careful not to fall into bishop takes a1 and now knight takes f7, when suddenly white regains the initiative. King takes f7 would be met by queen takes e6 check, and after king f8, white's bishop on c1 emerges out to the a3 square and gives an absolutely deadly check. Instead of taking this rook on a1, black can improve his play with queen takes d4, attacking this knight on e5 in addition to the rook on a1. If white now plays knight takes f7, then unfortunately for him he loses his queen to bishop d3. If instead of capturing on f7, white retreats his knight with knight f3, black still wins material with queen d3. The point is that this rook on a1 is attacked and in fact has nowhere to go. If queen takes d3, then bishop takes d3 check is followed by a rook lunch for this bishop on c3. Similar lines to this can occur after a5, a4, bishop b4 check, and now c3, knight takes c3. If instead of c3, white plays bishop d2, then he gets hit by the move knight f4, attacking the queen, this pawn on g2, and also the pawn on d4. So white's usual move after the bishop check has been to go king f1, but then of course he loses castling rights without making any kind of dent on black's position. Upon realising that knight e5 isn't dangerous for black after all, white has generally chosen to play in a way analogous to the main line with h5, bishop h7, bishop d3. But now we start to see the advantages of black having delayed the knight d7 move. He plays bishop takes d3, queen takes d3, e6, and is now ready to attack the d4 pawn with c5, followed by bringing his knight out to c6. Another advantage of this delayed knight d7 is that if white tries to take the h2 b8 diagonal by going bishop out to f4, black can immediately challenge this bishop with bishop d6. After a further knight e5, queen c7, black wants to eliminate this knight on e5 by going knight d7 on his next move. And in 2 games against the Spanish player Margen Badals, Tiviakov has tried 2 different moves and on neither occasion got anywhere. The first game was from the 1998 New York Open, in which he played knight e4, and after knight takes e4, queen takes e4, knight d7, brought his rook into play with rook h3. But then black castled queenside, white also castled queenside, and now black exchanged into a completely equal position with knight takes e5. Instead of knight e4, Tiviakov castled queenside in their game in Beijing. But again he got absolutely nothing after knight d7, challenging the knight on e5, and now knight e4 was met by knight takes e4, queen takes e4, castles queenside once again. I actually think that black could have castled kingside in this position if he wanted a sharper straddle. Black wants to undermine white's d4 pawn with his thematic c5, and the open d and c files in this position will point directly at white's king. Instead of knight e5, Tiviakov simply exchanged bishops, with bishop takes d6, in his game against Henkin from Arco 1998. But of course this wasn't enough for any advantage. Henkin recaptured, of course, and then castle's queenside was met by knight bd7, and after white played king b1, black castled kingside. Again we've got an opposite side castling scenario in which black's going to play on the d and c files with c5 and rook f d8 followed by rook a c8. Once again it's quite possible that white's king will feel the draft. With bishop f4 running into what is effectively a brick wall after bishop d6, most white players have tended to put this bishop on a more modest square, d2. Now, however, black can instigate his plan with c5, hitting d4. And if white castles queenside, he brings his knight out to c6. If white now defends this d4 pawn by going bishop c3, black can play queen d5, both centralising his queen and hitting this pawn on a2. A game between Asrian and Yermolinsky from New York 1998 continued d takes c5, queen takes d3, rook takes d3, and now bishop takes c5, which actually hits this pawn on f2. White played bishop takes f6, black recaptured, of course, and then he went knight e4. But just bishop e7 was really fine for black. One important thing to remember is that in many Caro-Kann endgames, black actually gets chances because of the potential weakness of this pawn on h5. If instead of bishop c3, white plays his bishop to e3, then black should develop his queen with queen out to b6. In a game between Agnos and Atalik from the Greek Team Championship in 1998, white now played queen b3, and after queen takes b3, a takes b3, c takes d4, knight takes d4, black could actually have got the better endgame by now playing the sharp move knight d5, hitting this bishop on e3. After knight takes c6, black doesn't recapture on c6, but instead takes off this bishop on e3. And after f takes e3, b takes c6, the move knight e4 can be met by rook d8, stopping the knight from coming into d6. Atalik's analysis continued with g4, and now he suggested that black plays his bishop out to b4, the idea being that the bishop can come to a5 and then b6 to hit this pawn on e3. Once again, a critical factor for black in this endgame is the weakness of white's kingside pawns on h5 and now also g4. Black will often be able to set up a passed pawn on the kingside quite quickly, which supported by his bishop should outplay a knight.